Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in the final day of the 2017 Champion Showdown. There's only two competitors left: Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, Liren, the Chinese grandmaster, who will be playing in the Canada's tournament next year, trying to get a chance to play Magnus Carlsen for the world championship. All the other competitors, they started early, so they finished early, but we just have a heads-up battle between Magnus Carlsen and Liren. And the world champion Carlsen has pretty much dominated for the past 3 days. And today they're going to be playing 12 games of blitz chess with 5-minute time controls. They get no extra time added for each additional move. So the game will last no more than 10 minutes in total. Each side's getting 5 minutes. White's going to be played in this game by Liren, and Black's going to be played by Magnus Carlsen. We'll go ahead and get started. Knight to f3, knight f6, pawn c4, pawn c5. So getting into the English opening symmetrical opening, knight to c3, pawn e6, pawn g3. We've seen some crazy different openings from these two players specifically that we haven't really seen from the other 6 competitors that were here or at top level play, but you can tell they studied up for this particular tournament with the blitz and the rapid section, knowing that their opponents would not be as prepared for these faster variations of chess, and so just trying out some new stuff. Bishop here to g2, fianchetto on the king side. Bishop b7. Both sides really trying to control the light squares in the board. Castle on the king side. Pawn a6, rook e1, centralizing. And then we see, after pawn e4, exchange in the center of the board. And this is a hedgehog pawn formation. You don't see it all that often from Black's perspective. He trades off his c pawn for his opponent's d pawn, and many times White will have a pawn here on c4 in e4, but Black has pawn structure on a6, b6, d6, e6. Hedgehog formation, I just don't see it too often at high level play. Many times it looks like it's cramped from Black's perspective, but there's so many ways that Black can counter depending on where White wants to go, that many players tend to like this sort of play because they can go down some very aggressive paths if they want to, and they can adjust. If they wanted to play a knight to d7 and then come down here to c5, they could play that. If they wanted to control the dark squares or the light squares in the center of the board, they can adjust depending on where their opponent goes to. So this gives Magnus Carlsen a lot of options depending on how the Chinese Grandmaster wants to continue for White. Magnus plays queen to c7, just continuing his development. Bishop here to e3, same as well, getting the dark square bishop involved into the game. Knight to d7, rook over here to c1, just getting ready to push forward in the center of the board. Rook to c8, getting the rooks involved to the semi-open file. It'll be interesting to see what Magnus Carlsen does with his king here as far as castling on the king side of the board or not castling on the king side of the board. Pawn to f4, and this is where things start to get interesting from White. Always if you fianchetto, it's tough to push one of your pawns because there's just so much in front of your king pushing forward at so much space that if your opponent can ever break through, can have a huge attack on your king. So from here, we just don't see it too often. But from White's perspective, he needs to be pretty aggressive here. And he's down so many games to Magnus Carlsen. He has to throw everything he can. He can't sit back and let Magnus Carlsen attack him. So while I like this move, it is very, very difficult, I think, in a blitz game to play this against Magnus Carlsen because he is going to attack relentlessly at your king now. Queen back here to b8. This opens up for this rook on c8 to attack and also just defend the semi-open file if he wants to play knight to c5 at some point. Pawn to g4 says, okay, we're going all in right here. And I think this is where Magnus Carlsen decided that he was not going to castle on the king side. Usually want to do that for king side safety and then attack on the queen side, but it doesn't really look like the queen side's where the action is going on. He can easily attack on the king side. His opponent's king is not safe at all. He needs to make sure that he's protected here, and all I think that's going to happen is if he casts on the king side is he wastes a move, and then his opponent can continue to throw everything in the kitchen sink at the king side. So for now, decides not to castle, plays pawn to h5 instead, says, yeah, I'm gonna pretend and play as though I castled on the queen side and start to throw everything at your king side of the board. Pawn up here to g5, forcing the knight to move. Knight comes down here to g4. It has a nice little outpost from this pawn on h5, also attacking the bishop here on e3. And then pawn up to g6. So white trying to be extremely aggressive right here. And, there's a few options on the board. We see rook takes on c4. If instead, after pawn to g6, we were to see the knight take on e3. Well, this gets tricky because now the rook recaptures, and then we could see pawn to e5, and then the pawn takes, the king recaptures. Maybe now this pawn takes. White's really controlling the center of the board. This king is open, ready for attack. Rook here to c2, getting ready to swing over here to f2. I think this puts a lot of unnecessary pressure on Magnus Carlsen. Could have also, if he came back here, said, instead of taking with my knight here, what if I try just pawn to f6? Well, this is just as bad because then knight to e6, blowing up the center of the board. There's now an isolated pawn here on d6 that white can start to attack. Next move, knight to d5. If doesn't really matter, kind of what black decides to do here. He needs to hold on to this pawn, so maybe rook to g8, then knight to d5. If there is an exchange, great. Queen comes up here, takes on d5. White's just completely winning this middle of the board state. I think this will be an easy victory for white. So in the game, Magnus Carlsen decided, yeah, I'm not going to worry about that pawn too much. I'm going to go ahead and take material here on c4. Then after the pawn takes, the king recaptures on f7. So both sides have a king exposed. Now just comes down to time control. Who can attack their opponent quickly and come out with a victory? White continues with bishop down here to f1, attacking the rook. And then now the knight decides to go ahead and take here on e3, as we expected at some point. Rook captures on e3. Rook captures here on d4. So decides, yeah, I want to give up my rook here. This knight here on d4 is a very powerful square. So I'm going to go ahead and take that. Queen recaptures. A pawn here to b5. White definitely won this exchange. He has a queen, two rooks, a bishop and a knight getting into the endgame. Black does only have this one rook over here on h8, and it's not very active right now. He had it here to push forward with the pawn h5, but the pawn h5, initially he was attacking on the king side. It's kind of all by himself right now. This queen on b8 is kind of stuck right here, not doing too much. So, all things considered, I think white definitely has a advantage in this spot. And even b5 doesn't seem like it does too much on this board state. Maybe if he tried something else, d5, trying to block off the center of the board, have some counterplay. He has both the pawn and the bishop defending this square. So I think this gives him some options, and swing his rook over to the center, try to control it a little bit. But pawn to b5, okay, sure, yeah, we'll go with that. A rook to g3, just starting to attack some pieces. He has a queen and a rook, both attacking the square here on g7, so you can see the threat that's happening here. Bishop to f6, putting a stop to that, and then pawn to e5. I'm not sure that pawn e5 is really the best play here. It's really just stopping your queen from attacking this diagonal right here. Could have maybe tried queen back here to e3, not push forward right away, but in the game decided to play pawn to e5. Bishop comes back here to d8, and then the decisive move in the game, and that is the knight coming here to e4. Unfortunately, white didn't see that after bishop back here to d8, this was not necessarily fully a retreat move. Sometimes you always want to have multiple things going on with your moves. In this particular case, the pawn comes up here to e5. Liren, I think, just thought, yeah, the bishop has to move back here. So he comes back to d8. Didn't see where it could come to, and that is after knight to e4, then bishop down to b6, pinning the queen to the king here on a g1. White's going to go down a ton of material. Now you could look at it and you could say there's definitely ways to block this if white just wants to give up free material. Let's say knight to c5. Okay, that's fine. The knight can come here, freely take the knight here on c5. The queen still has to move. It gets kind of awkward because knight to a4. That's still defending the bishop. The queen is being pinned down. So the queen's going to have to move more than likely. Could throw his rook up here to c5. White's just going to go down too much material. And all in all, I think Dean Liren has just been emotionally dominated over this series. And while I think he probably would have lost, I would have liked to see him play a little bit longer, but resigned after he saw the move bishop here to b6. And just for those kind of looking at the entire tournament, Magnus Carlsen, to just kind of explain how dominant he was, they play 30 games. And these are blitz and rapid, and if you see high-level play, there's not as many wins as you would expect. But Magnus Carlsen, over the 30 games, he won 16 games, and he lost 2, and then he tied the remaining 12. Won 16 and lost 2. So just absolutely dominated, and I think that's part of what just led to this. Dean Liren was like, okay, yeah, this isn't going to go well. I've been playing for 3 days. This guy's just been destroying me. I don't want to play any longer. Let's go ahead and pack up, go to the next game, get these 5-minute blitz games out of the way so I can go home because I just don't stand a chance against this guy. Magnus Carlsen is just playing too well. And a couple years ago, won both the Rapid and the Blitz championship. The guy is not only amazing at normal time limit for chess, but blitz and rapid as well. So congratulations to Magnus Carlsen. We had 8 competitors in the Champion Showdown. Each of the 4 winners in their head-to-head battle get $60,000. The loser for each head-to-head battle get $40,000. So not a bad payday for Dean Liren, even when you lose a ton, to go home with $40,000. But great tournament. Got to see a ton of chess when each of the heads-up battles was 30 games over 4 days. That's always exciting. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this coverage. And until next time, thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.